thanks again to Larry for inviting me and including me in this. My friend, my dive buddy, and I look up to him as an expert on all these things. I'm really just an amateur, but I have been getting into underwater videography lately, and I've gotten excited about it, so I'm glad to have the opportunity to share with you. I guess it's kind of a mixed group. Not everybody's a diver, but hopefully we won't talk too much about diving specific things, but more about how to share your underwater experiences, even if it's just snorkeling with your friends back home. A few words about me. I've been involved in photography for a very long time. The one with all the hair on the left is me. There is one person in this room who remembers when that photo was taken, and I'm not going to ask her to identify herself, but I was a photography counselor in the 70s at a camp I went to. But I've actually been involved with diving for a lot longer than that. Here I am in my old J valve in the late 60s, and I don't remember exactly where that was. But before I was into diving, I was into snorkeling as well. Snorkeling gave me these, isn't that cute? Can you believe I was ever that small, right? So I've been involved with the underwater world for a very long time, but it's only recently that the technology has gotten to the point where I can really make videos and bring them back to you and share my excitement for about the underwater world with my friends and family who don't dive. So this is sort of the breakdown of my talk. I'm going to talk first about the history of underwater video. I know it sounds a little boring and teachy, but I think it's nice to have some context and understand how far we've come when you can just go out there and buy an amazing system and go underwater and take great videos. I'll talk a bit about the equipment. I'm going to talk a little bit about lighting and filters. Lighting, of course, is central to every type of imaging. And I'm going to go over some shooting tips. I put post-production there because I think it's important to remember that it's a big part of the process. But because of limits of time, I'm not going to talk a lot about that. I'm certainly happy to chat with anybody individually afterwards, or if there's a break, about post-production things. But that's for another talk. History. This is the first photograph ever taken. And you can tell our film sensitivity has come a long way, because to get that picture in the early 19th century took about a 6-hour exposure. But it was the first image ever produced from a rooftop in France. And the first underwater photograph was actually also done in the 19th century. And you can imagine what it took to sink a camera in a waterproof housing with a light source. And they it had surface supply. Diving, as you know, is much older than scuba diving. And so there were people doing this sort of helmet diving back in the 19th century. And there is, from just the closing year of the 19th century, the first underwater photograph taken, a self-portrait taken. Who else is going to take it at 164 feet in 1899 of Louis Boutin? And this is the first underwater color photo. And the reason I put this in is because color imaging takes a lot more light. And one thing you lose, as we'll see when you go underwater, is light, and also the color content of the light. The spectrum shifts a lot. So color photography is a much more difficult thing. This is a quarter century later, and in order to get enough light down to the bottom of a relatively shallow reef here at 15 feet, this is the lighting they had to use. This is a raft with a huge magnesium powder flash, which was set off, triggered by the shutter, and then the subject is 15 feet below. That is not something that's available outside, but that's what you needed back then, before our sensors got to the point that they could take beautiful pictures without so much artificial light. And then movies. Well, I put this in as the first movie ever. I thought it was cool that I could show you the first movie ever made. This is Thomas Edison's famous first sneeze, a Fred Ott sneeze. And my son is a film editor and a recent graduate in film from Wesleyan, and he mocked me for saying that this was the first movie. He said, of course that's not the first movie. There's a lot of other ones. And I said, well, I'm just going to say it's the first movie. But my son, who's smarter than I, says it's not. And finally, the first underwater movies. The first underwater movie was in 1914. A guy, John Ernest Williamson, made a movie in the Bahamas. And to tell you about him, let me just tell you about his father. This is his father as a sea captain. And one of the things that was a big industry going back in the 19th century with the age of a lot of freight traveling by ship was salvage. It was very difficult to salvage things from sunken ships, but it was also very lucrative. And you can imagine big gold bullion and whatnot on the bottom of the ocean. You wanted to figure out some way of recovering it. And so this guy came up with this sort of flexible, collapsible tube made with iron rings and leather that you could lower from a boat, and you could drop it down here, and you could, the sunken ship, and you could go and salvage all the stuff from the sunken ship. Very useful device. And so his son, John Williamson, said, well, we could use that for photography. So he put this on, instead of the diving bell with all the arms for salvage, he put this thing on the end. It's called a photosphere. And so basically a viewing chamber, and you get access to it from above. And in 1913, he did some photographs in Chesapeake Bay, which I imagine was probably a little clearer than it is now. And then in 1914, he actually made some underwater motion pictures. Here he is going into the tube. Here is a still from one of those pictures. The first movie was in the tropical seas. The first commercial underwater video, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, was actually made by a major film company and is based on the Jules Verne novel. And just to show you what the kind of technology they had to invent to get this to work, this is their main prop. It's this mobile octopus, and I have a whole video of this, but I don't really want to take too much time here, just to show you that this guy actually patented an underwater prop octopus for the first motion picture. So you see, underwater video produces the need for lots of other kind of inventions, and some of them we'll talk about today. And so going from that technology, patented in 1912, or 1917, we're going to talk about underwater video equipment. Aren't you glad we're done with the history part of the talk? Was that okay? Okay. So underwater video equipment, and I'm going to break it down again into a couple of categories. First, we'll talk about dedicated video cameras, that is, things that just do video. Compact cameras, the point and shoots. Then we'll talk a little bit about those waterproof compact cameras that Dave was mentioning before. Micro Four Thirds, the GoPro, which has become a very popular way of shooting underwater video. And then I'll finish up with what I use, which is a single lens reflex camera. So we'll start with talking about a dedicated video camera. Now, when I say dedicated video camera, there are different levels of this. There are pro-level cameras, phenomenally expensive systems that would be used by a professional videographer. And there's consumer-level camcorders that you could buy for relatively inexpensively. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these systems. Now, here is my friend Pete, who's an underwater videographer, with his new professional camera and underwater video housing. And you can see how big it is. You can see, though, it's actually fairly easy, maneuverable underwater. Things are obviously a lot easier to maneuver big things like this underwater. You can see here, he's doing a nice pan with that. And that's an Equinox housing, a large Equinox housing, which we do sell. An idea what that looks like. And you can see you can actually tag it along with you pretty well wherever you go. It doesn't really slow them down too much. The size and weight, as we'll talk a little bit, is actually a benefit. It sort of stabilizes things. When you're shooting video, stability is important. When you're shooting a strobe photo, it doesn't matter if the camera's moving a little bit, but having that big thing really gives you nice, smooth pans. So what's the advantage of having a pro video camera in a housing? Well, obviously, the video is incredible quality. Also, the lenses are very good because they have interchangeable lenses, so you can buy very high-quality lenses. And high-end lenses, high-quality lenses usually translates to faster lenses, meaning with better low-light performance, wider aperture lets more light in. And also, the high-end cameras have higher frame rates, which is good if you're doing slow motion effects. You're shooting at a higher frame rate, and then you can slow it down. You can get nice, smooth, slow video, which is something that these pro cameras really shine at. And as I said before, having that extra bulk can reduce the camera shake, and just having a larger sensor, the area of the camera that actually receives the light and converts it into images is bigger in these cameras. So one of the things that translates to is better sensitivity in low light. So you're less dependent on artificial lighting. And these images are so good, the sensors are so big that if you grab a single frame at a very high frame rate, it may be good enough to pass as a still image. So even though you don't really take still images with these cameras per se, the individual frames can substitute for that. The cons obviously are the cost, size and weight above the water is a negative. There are workflow issues because these things generate very large files. And it's not really a substitute for a dedicated camera with a strobe. If you want to switch to photography, yes, you can grab a frame, but you wouldn't have a way of syncing your strobes with that, and so you would lose the ability to do some of the amazing work that Larry will show you in the second half of this talk. Just to give you an idea of what it would cost to put a system like this together, this is the red Epic M system, which is sort of the top of the line for digital video cameras. If you look at this with a Gates housing and a lens port, and the lens in the cat is a relatively small portion of it, you're looking about $50,000 by the time you put everything together with the lights. So really a tool of professionals. A lot of these are just rented and not actually purchased unless you're talking about a big production house. But you don't need to go to that extreme to do underwater video with a dedicated camera. This is Pete's old housing. It's also by Equinox, but it's for housing sort of a smaller consumer level video camera. And you can see it's significantly smaller. Same basic design with the controls by the grips there. The advantage is here. If you look at technology, one thing that has really progressed over the past few years is the quality of relatively cheap sensors. And so a modern consumer-level camcorder can actually produce fairly good video if you compare to something from just 5 or 6 years ago. These are a lot less expensive. It's very flexible to have a camera with a wide zoom in it, because unlike with a digital SLR where you're sort of locked into either doing wide angle or macro, you have the whole range of camera angles in one camera on a single dive. But again, these smaller sensor sizes don't produce anywhere near the quality of images that you'd get with a pro-level camera, and you only have one lens built in, so you're sort of stuck with whatever that is. And the frames really aren't good enough for acceptable still images. But you can put together a nice underwater dedicated camcorder system for about $1,500 if you get one of these little cameras. You can get one of these small used camera. This is the old Equinox Pro 6 housing. So obviously a big cost advantage there. Now, compact cameras, these almost everybody was carrying these around a few years ago. I think the fact that smartphones have such good cameras in them now, I think that's eaten into this market a lot. So I have one of these, and I carry it a lot less now because of this. But they're still great cameras, and it's amazing the quality of lens and sensor that you can get into something relatively small. And there are housings available for a lot of these point-and-shoot cameras. They're inexpensive, small size and weight, and it's nice because you want to have a travel camera with you anyway, so it's nice if you can use the same camera for underwater photography and video and as your travel topside camera. Most of these will shoot stills and video, and as I said, just like with the consumer camcorders, allows you to do wide angle and macro on the same dive. Again, trade-off. Everything's a trade-off in sensor size and lens quality and low light performance. Here's some people using these little point and shoots in the housings, and you can see you can actually set up a reasonably good lighting system with that and a frame and a tray to help you stabilize. Even though it's small, it's going to be shaky. By constructing your whole rig well, you can make a relatively stable system. And this is also a lot less expensive. I mean, Icolite housing for a camera like this might be about $300 or so. I mean, Larry will talk more about that kind of stuff. The cameras are maybe a few $100s. And usually for video, and we'll talk a little bit more about the need for lighting, for video, you usually going to want to add at least one external light, especially for macro work. So I put those prices in so you can get an idea of what we're talking about. Now, waterproof compact cameras, I don't have a lot of experience with them, but as Dave was saying, it's really nice to be able to just jump in the water with a camera and not worry about the housing or the O-ring or the sealing or leaking or flooding or anything. And you do get pretty acceptable video. Again, you're limited to shallow depths. Number one, because the housing, the camera's waterproof rating itself is only usually around 30, 40 feet. And number two, because you're not usually shooting with any kind of artificial light, you're limited to ambient light. And the small sensor is not going to do great in low light. But for sort of surf pictures, it's very good. Good for snorkeling and boating. They're very rugged. The fact that makes them waterproof also makes them unlikely to be sensitive to getting dust and sand and dirt in them. So they're nice little cameras to carry around. I think you'll have some to show later. Micro Four Thirds, I don't know a lot about, but Larry shoots these, and he will talk to you. What this is a proprietary standard that was created by Olympus and Panasonic. They do have interchangeable lenses like the digital SLR. There is no mirror, so you don't have the through-the-lens optical viewfinder. And think about it as somewhere intermediate in terms of sensor size and image quality and weight between a point-and-shoot and a digital SLR. Now, GoPro. Many of you have probably seen GoPro. This is sort of these self-contained little cameras that shoot images and video, and they're sold with a waterproof housing. The whole thing about $300, and then you start adding on all the accessories. That's where it gets you. But they've become incredibly popular amongst divers recently. When they originally sold, they didn't have the right type of dome port in front of the lens, so you had to go buy an aftermarket dome port so that it would correct for the distortion underwater. Although now the GoPro itself is making them. So you can really get yourself a whole camera system for not much money at all. When I switched my diving gear configuration this year to larger tanks, I didn't want to have my big camera with me for the first few dives because I was worried about doing too much what's called task loading, where I have to deal with all the new equipment and my big heavy dive equipment too. So I switched to one of these, and so I had a little experience shooting one of these this year, and I will show you a little bit about what that video looks like. And although it's nowhere near what you can get on DSLR, it's not bad, and with certain caveats, it certainly has its place. These are very inexpensive. The mounting configurations are very flexible. These things are marketed not just for divers. Dive is a very small demographic for them, but skateboarders and motorcycle racers and mountain climbers and hang gliders and everybody who does anything with these things will figure out some way to mount them on the end of a stick or whatever. I did some video where I put it on my guitar neck and shot down. I gave one to my son for his 18th birthday, and we went kayaking, and he stuck it on the kayak paddle, so you can imagine what that video looked like. And a lot of topside use. They take stills and video. There are some cons. Obviously, you know, for the price, you don't get everything. They're not great in low light. The underwater quality is not as good. The topside quality is really quite good, especially if you have a nice bright day. You'd be amazed at how good the HD video is. Battery life, I've had some issues with. I think they're improving that in the latest version. Since everything is controlled by one button, it's a little confusing underwater to switch between modes, and it can be a little difficult to use. And one of my biggest complaints about these is it tends to produce a lot of bad video. Now that's really more of an indictment of people's editing, but what people will often do is just put it on a helmet or put it on a strap onto their hood and just let it go. And you'll get like a half an hour of just random video where they're not looking through the scene, so they're not. It is seeing what you're seeing, but it doesn't produce very watchable video. It's a big difference between actually looking at the LCD monitor and aiming something and just letting something run. Now you can get an LCD monitor for those, and you can use it like a regular camera, but that's just a caveat. The latest iteration of the GoPro is the Hero 3. They started with the Hero. I have the Hero 2, now the Hero 3, and it comes in 3 different versions, and you can look at the specs if you're interested. But these are very sophisticated camera for $400 and includes the housing, and it has built-in Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi remote is included. There's an app for smartphones. They've enhanced the low-light performance a lot. So it's something to take a look at. Like I say, it's sort of here to stay, and although I can say, yes, the SLR is better, I recognize that a lot of people are using these now for underwater video. You can put together a whole system like this. This is one example of, with a little tray and a nice video light for less than $1,000 and really produce pretty good video. And now I'm going to talk about digital single lens reflex cameras because that's what I do. That's what I use. Starting around 2008, Nikon came out with video on a digital SLR, and at this point, most of the digital SLRs have video as well. And what the advantage here is a digital SLR has a fairly large sensor compared to a point and shoot, or even compared to a camcorder. And you also have the option of using very high quality, very fast lenses. And compared to a pro video camera, this is much cheaper. Even a high-end digital SLR is going to cost a lot less than a high-end pro video camera and produce beautiful images. A lot of professional videographers, a lot of TV work is done using DSLRs now. You get this kind of background blur, that bokeh that everybody loves the look of, where it really makes the subject stand out. That's a function of the very fast lens and the wide aperture. And it's less of an issue underwater. You really don't do that kind of stuff underwater because of the nature of filming through water. And mostly you're using either fisheye lens with a large depth of field or a macro lens where the background is less of a feature. But it has this nice filmic quality, and the DSLRs are wonderful for topside video. For underwater video, the low light capacities, especially the ones with the larger sensors, is excellent. If you look at the latest iteration of these really can produce very nice video without lights at pretty impressive depths. You can get good lenses. Again, bigger camera, less shake due to the mass of the camera. A lot of manual controls, and this is also very important when you're doing your lighting and exposure underwater. You really want to have full control of the aperture and the shutter speed to be able to control the lighting in the foreground and the lighting in the background. And plus, if you stop shooting video, you have strobes there, you can go and take beautiful still images as well. Cost and weight is a thing that may steer some people away from these. You obviously can't switch from macro to wide angle. You do have zoom lenses, but you wouldn't really have that extent of a zoom. So really, you basically decide ahead of time. And if you put on your macro lens, that's when the whale shark will show up. So you always want to think ahead of time. Or you can be like some people and just have 2 cameras with you and have somebody to carry it along with you. I don't think many people can afford that. A lot of them don't, especially the early ones, don't allow autofocus while recording video, which is really less of an issue because number one, if you're shooting fisheye or wide-angle video, the depth of field is so great, focus is not quite so critical as it is with macro. And also, you really don't want your autofocus sort of hunting for a focus lock while you're recording. It makes for a very bad video. So usually what you do is you sort of focus first, either manual or lock on with the autofocus, and then shoot, and try to turn the autofocus off during your actual clip. Most of the modern DSLRs come with video nowadays. And normally when you're buying a digital SLR, your purchase strategy is, well, you know, the camera is less of an issue than the lens. The lens is, having a good lens will improve your photographs a lot more than having a good camera body. I mean, there are advantages to the body in terms of, you know, number of frames per second you can take and the sensor size, but you should spend your money on good lenses first and then upgrade the body when you can afford it, because the lenses will fit, and you buy Canon lenses, you can fit them on the upgraded Canon body. The problem with doing that underwater is that the housings are very specifically designed to one body. So the housing kind of locked, and the housing is much more expensive than the camera, probably about 3 times as much for the digital SLR. So a housing kind of locks you into a specific camera body, and as Larry says, you know, the camera is more of an accessory for the housing than the other way around. You sure really need to think ahead of time how much camera you need before buying the expensive housing to surround it. I put this little slide together to give you an idea. This is certainly not an exhaustive review, but these are 5 good cameras for underwater video from Canon and Nikon. And you see along the top row, there's something called the crop factor. I don't know if you're familiar with what that means, but cameras either can have a large sensor or a small sensor. The larger sensor is close to the size of a piece of 35mm film. The higher the crop factor, the smaller the sensor. And so the first 3 on the left are more like consumer levels cameras. The ones on the right are more of pro-level digital SLRs. And you see with a much larger sensor area, and that translates to much better quality at high film speeds, high ISO, and also a wider field of view for a given lens. And it's reflected in the cost. I use a Canon 7D, which I'm very happy with. It's several years old, but you know, to upgrade that would involve upgrading the whole housing, and I'm not planning on doing that anytime soon. The advantage of a full frame sensor is the better low light performance and also a better dynamic range, which means you get better detail and colors throughout the range from light to dark. The cons are the depth of field is narrower at any given aperture. Now, normally that's a plus for topside photography where you're trying to get that bokeh, that separation of the background. Underwater, you really just want everything to be sharp, and with rare exceptions, so that's an issue. You can get vignetting with some of the lenses if you put you know, a lens that's designed for a crop sensor on a wide-angle body. You can, on a full frame body, you get some vignetting, which means the shadow around the outside, and of course the cost. Any given focal length lens is going to have a wider angle of view on a full-size sensor camera than on a crop sensor camera. That's either a pro or a con, depending on whether you're trying to go wider or not. Generally, underwater photography, again, you're trying to get as close as possible, wide angle as possible, and so it's considered to be a plus to have a larger sensor. I'm not going to talk a lot about lenses because I think Larry's going to talk about them, but you can just sort of think about them as 3 main classes of lens. The standard wide angles, and the one that I used for many years is the Tokina 12-24. The fisheye lens, this is an incredibly popular lens for underwater photography. It's relatively inexpensive, very crisp and clear, and nice 10mm lens, you know, which sounds, if you're used to shooting 35mm camera, that sounds very, very wide, but actually, remember, we're talking about the crop sensor cameras, so it's not quite that wide. And then a macro lens, and this is the one I use. I use the Tamron 60mm macro. I also have a Canon 100mm macro, but I find for the crop sensor camera, which gives you a little more, think about it giving you a little more magnification, this works fine, and you have less problems with shake. I don't use this for video very much, and you will see why when I show you what my underwater macro video looks like, which is terrible. And some people can do it well, not me. Housings. I sort of break down the housings into 2 classes. There's Icolite, and then there's all the metal housings. Icolite is a very popular company. It's been around for a long time. They're good housings. I had one for a while. They're acrylic housings, and the way they work is they have sort of one box shape that they make many, many, many of, and then for each different type of camera, they drill the holes in different places. So from a production point of view, they're a lot less expensive because they don't have to make a different housing for every camera. They can just sort of, for each camera, just change where they put the controls. So that's reflected in the cost. These are about half the cost of metal housings. These are the housing itself without the dome port are about $1,400 as opposed to a good metal housing. You know, like the one I use, Nauticam, might be about $3,200. So is this an issue? I personally like my new housing. I think there are some fit and some control issues with this. Since you're actually relying on the holes being drilled in the right place, occasionally there's problems with the controls. I've also had an issue. The one time I had a camera flood was when an O-ring fell out. When I took the dome port off, and there's an O-ring around there that seals it. And normally it's water pressure sort of holds it into place. So you have these little thin plastic clips that hold the thing on while you're topside. And as soon as you're underwater, the water pressure compresses the dome port into to the housing, it's fine, but I had noticed that the thing, since it's just sort of sitting there, it fell out and I put it back together. This was several years ago. It's the one time I ever had a flood. So I don't think it's a great design, but on the other hand, you are saving a good bit of money. The aluminum housings are, first of all, very durable, and I've actually dropped one, and if you don't hit the dome port, they really can take a beating. And since they are designed around the camera, there's not as much air in there. They're more negative. They have a much tighter fit, and the controls seem to work a lot better with this. You have a very positive lock for making sure your dome port is on. You know that you can very easily check to make sure it's completely intact. And one of the biggest reasons for flooding is human error. It's very rare that you have a flood because of some design flaw in a housing. Even the cheaper housings are designed pretty well. You have to know how to use them. You have to know how to maintain the O-rings and make sure when you take them apart, you clean the O-ring at regular intervals and lubricate it regularly. So they do require a little help, and they're of course more expensive. These are just some close-up things. You can see how the O-ring is trapped in this nice groove there. It's not falling anywhere. This is the lock for the dome port. You know when that green is there, then you're definitely locked in and it's 100% okay. Very nicely designed piece of gear. So how much do these cost? Well, this is my talks about video, so I left this stuff down here as more for still photography. But the housing, this is a representative housing, and the aluminum housings are all similar in price, about $3,200. A dome port, I'm now using a smaller dome port. You may have seen a lot of people with those big 6-inch or 8-inch dome ports. I've switched to a 100mm dome port, which is smaller for wide angle and fisheye photography, mainly because it's so much easier to pack and carry. The really only downside of this is over-under shots. But other than that, it seems to work very well. And then the fisheye lens and the Canon body is about $1,200 for a 7D. And if you add a couple of the lights, which we'll talk about in a bit, the whole video system about $7,200. And then if you add a couple of $800 strobes and a macro lens and another port for the macro lens, by the time you get finished putting your whole video system together, about 10 grand. Here's a plug. I actually was rinsing out my dive gear at the end of a trip in North Carolina, and my buddy and I were had all our stuff out on the table, and I said, okay, I'm going to go up take a shower. You stay here with the stuff, and then you take a shower, and I'll come back. And I had my camera out there, and I came back, and I said, where's the camera? And somebody had apparently been watching us, and as soon as she just turned her head for a minute, just walked off with the whole thing. Dan Insurance. Anybody buys this stuff, get Dan Insurance. It's actually not through Dan. It's Dan is Divers Action Network, Divers Alert Network, and they refer you to another company that sells it. But I thought it was just flood insurance. I bought it because I was afraid to get flooded. It turns out it's theft insurance too. Wonderful service. They cut me a check it was a $100 deductible. They cut me a check for the whole thing. I just emailed them my receipts within about a week. So yes, these are very nice systems, and they're very appealing to people. Never found it. I lost the last day's photograph, so that's the thing I was most upset about, since I got the money back. All right, now let's talk a little bit about underwater lighting, because lighting is very, very important. This slide, you'll see this slide or a slide like it a lot in talks about underwater photography, underwater video. You may see one in the next hour. Both of us stole it from the same place. Bottom line is, but we didn't invent the concept of light absorption at depth. The deeper you are underwater, the more of the light spectrum that gets absorbed, and what gets absorbed preferentially are the reds. And so the red end of the spectrum tends to fall away, and as you get deeper, you're left with just the greens and the blues. And that's why if you just sort of take video underwater, especially more than a few feet underwater, you notice everything has a kind of bluish-green cast to it. So there's 3 ways that you can get light into your video. Ambient light, that's the sun. Ambient light using a filter, talk a little bit about that. And artificial light, which is the floodlights that you bring down with you. So unfiltered light for video. And this actually works pretty well in shallow, clear water. Snorkeling, it works great if you especially have a bright sunlight. Really best above 20 feet. Once you get much below that, you kind of lose a lot of the color quality. It tends to look very blue and green. And again, this is something that's improving. If you look at a modern camcorder, they're actually very good at sort of fighting that loss. But still, at some point, you're going to lose the reds, and everything's going to look green. Surface conditions obviously affect available light. So on a cloudy day, you're going to have less. It may seem nice and bright on the boat, but there's a big difference underwater between bright Caribbean, a noonday sun with no clouds, and a sort of a hazy, overcast New Jersey morning. The time of day, the flat lighting at the end of the day or in dawn, if you're up that early diving, will affect the quality of light compared to topside lighting. Sometimes you can salvage a really green, washed out, unimpressive looking video by converting it to black and white. Here's, just to give you an example, this is kind of shallow, and you can see there's some color there. But it does have that kind of green washed out look. It's not only just, the color's not great, but the definition isn't great. It's got a kind of a muted quality to it. You know, even though this is pretty clear water, this is in Curacao, and you see if you switch to black and white, you get a lot more definition, and something that didn't look like much, I think really, you know, picks up into a more interesting thing. But that's kind of a gimmick, and you're obviously not going to be shooting everything in black and white. So that's where you're limited. So filters. Filters are a very clever idea, and I've been amazed at how widely applicable they have been for me, for both photography and video, especially diving around here. One of my passions is diving in our local New York area. We're living on the edge of a vibrant ecosystem, and it's wonderful that you can dive just on a weekend without having to go, fly to, Curacao. So I really push that a lot, and we can talk a little bit about that later. I have some video later showing you local diving, but it's nice to be, it really does extend your photographic and video range to environments where you wouldn't think you would see a lot of bright colors. There are blue water and green water and automatic versions of the filters, and what they do is they don't add color. Obviously they can't add color. What they do is they filter out the dominant blues and greens, so they're sort of the reverse of what water does. Water filters out the red end of the spectrum. This filters out the green end or the blue end of the spectrum. So the trade-off is, since you've got water cutting down the red light and this cutting the blue light, well, now you have the same spectrum, but you have a lot less overall light. So you do get a trade-off in the amount of light available. Also, since you're changing depths, the amount of blue-green absorption, red absorption is going to change at each depth. So you have to manually set the white balance every time you change depth, or if the angle of the ambient light, or if a cloud goes over the sun, you should do a new manual white balance so that the computer in your camera will produce reasonable quality colors. And you look here, this is pretty far down below. You see this red rust on the top of this wreck. That's down to about 80 feet, and it'd be pretty rare to see red so far underwater without using a video camera. Without using a filter. These are the ones I use. There are other companies too, but I think the Magic filters are a very good brand, a British company.
Question.
Yep.
So does a filter underwater, is it the same conversion? How many stops do you lose?
Well, I don't do a manual. I just use the auto exposure in the camera, but it would depend on the depth. But yeah, I'm sure that somewhere published there's an actual number of the stops. So this is a little video to show just sort of how the filters work in underwater videography. So this is unfiltered ambient light video. So it's an interesting shot, but it's completely unwatchable because it's all blue-green. Same here, this is at 45 feet. Some interesting stuff going on, but it looks very mushy. And here, this is a local wreck, and that's around 80 feet. And when you get pretty close, I may have had a little light there on it. This is 100 feet. This is in North Carolina, the U-352. And you can see we got actually very good visibility there. Probably 80 feet of visibility, but no colors there. So one solution is artificial light. And you can put a light on your camera, and that'll restore the color, but it only reaches a few feet. An artificial light on a camera, floodlight, reaches about 3 feet. So here, this is nice and colorful, but still the background is washed out. Did Steve come to the lecture? No, that's Solution number 2 is just stick to shallow water, but that really limits what you can shoot. If you are shooting in a couple of feet of Caribbean water, yeah, the color looks pretty good. Here, now this is at 25 feet. You see there's still a little bit of color there. Obviously, yeah, funny guy. I find as you're coming back up on the anchor line, especially if you get to the safety stop around 50 feet, that's when all your color comes back. So I have a lot of video of my buddies hanging out on the anchor line. This is solution number 3, filters. And like I say, this improves the color of the whole scene by filtering out the dominant blues and greens. So here's without ambient light, without a filter. And here's the same sort of scene with a filter. And you can see not only do the colors pick up, but you get a lot more detail in the background. And so you would never be able to light up a scene this wide. So the filter allows areas that are well lit, but would normally look blue-green, to pick up in color. Same thing if you're doing a close-up wide-angle scene, a lot more color there. These are relatively shallow, but you'll see it also works pretty well even when you get down to some depths. Here, see, coming up next. See, this is down on the in the Vandenberg in Key West, and you see that's about 70 feet.
How far?
How far what?
How far in depth?
How deep? The Vandenberg, the tower there is about 70 feet, 80 feet, the radio thing. That's 90 feet. That's the deck of the Vandenberg, or Spiegel Grove maybe. And you can see this is, again, shooting a sort of like I took that picture before, shooting down the anchor line. You can see all the way down to the wreck. You're still picking up some color. This is the green water version taken on a local wreck. It actually works pretty well, even in quarries. This is the quarry, the famous Dutch Springs in Pennsylvania. and it really brings out a lot of color in relatively deep scenes where you normally would have just sort of a murky brown. That's a more shallow in the quarry. One thing about it is that the lights turn out red because you're manually setting the white balance. Now your light is set to a different color temperature as than the ambient light, so since you're balancing for that, those are going to turn out red. But other than that, it works pretty well. Filters for underwater video. And let's talk a little about artificial light. Now, artificial light adds light and restores color, and it's good in deep water, obviously night dives. If you're working the hole or an overhead area, a lot of times you're shooting upwards, doing a silhouette shot, or shooting up into a brighter, even not into the sun, into the brighter surface. You'd lose a lot of detail in divers' faces or fish that are going overhead. So if you're close enough, like I said, within about 3 feet or so, a floodlight will bring out a lot of that detail. Wide coverage is important, especially if you're using a fisheye lens, or the GoPro has a very wide field of view. So if you just have one light, even if it's a pretty wide one, you'll often see, and I'll show you in a video later, you'll see like hot spots and fall off of the light. So if you can get 2 lights, really cover the whole scene, you'll get much better coverage. There are a number of different types of lights. There's halogen lights, HID lights, and LED. For the most part, LED is sort of dominant now because they're a lot cheaper. They've become a lot cheaper. The working lifetime is, the bulb is much longer. The power consumption is better. You don't need these big, huge external battery packs. So there are a lot of nice LED lights. I haven't used halogen in a while. Halogen gives you a nice, warm, soft lighting, although if you're correcting color and using filters, it's not quite so critical. I don't have experience with HID lights, but LED has become a thing to do. So now I'm going to go finish up with some general tips for shooting underwater video, and if there's time, I'm happy to answer questions. If there's no time, I'm happy to answer questions anyway. Number 1 tip, be a good diver. And this is really, really important because if you don't have good buoyancy and air consumption skills, you can have the red camera and the $50,000 housing and it's going to look like nothing. You got to be really comfortable with your gear so you're not worried so much about diving. You should be able to concentrate on the photography. And maintaining a stable platform is important. Sometimes you'll be anchoring, if you're on a sandy bottom, you can anchor yourself. Or just by having good buoyancy control, you can keep that shake from coming through in your clips. Slow movements, always underwater, always slow movements. You're less likely to silt the area, you're less likely to scare whatever you're going after, and it'll give you better footage. Number 2, and this is really usually number 1, but get close. And this is because when you're shooting video or shooting photography, the light has to travel from the subject to your camera lens sensor, and the more water that is between the subject and the sensor, the worse the picture, the worse the washout, the worse the focus, the worse the everything. So you really want to get as close as possible, like this. And the advantage of fisheye lenses is not just that they're wide angle. You know, think about it as taking for wide angle, like taking a picture of a shipwreck. Actually, one of the reasons why fish pictures come out so good with a fisheye lens, not because it's a fisheye, but is because you can really put, assuming your skills are good enough that you're not going to spook the animal, if you really get the camera very close to the subject, it doesn't look like it's very close, but so you're getting a beautiful image because there's so little water between you and the subject. Same thing goes between the subject and artificial light source. If you can get the light closer, like I said, these things really fall after about 3 feet. They're not providing any visible light, even a really powerful light, so you want that close too. Yes, if you're taking pictures of seascapes or wrecks, you're not going to be illuminating them. You're trying to get wide angle, but to do that, you really need a very clear water or a very fast lens, and that's sort of a separate thing. Pan with the subject, that's important. You want to sort of follow, a moving subject. Gives you kind of an interest. That's North Carolina. I don't know where that is. It's Fairway, I think. Keep the camera steady, even when you're moving. Here, see, I'm doing a shot where I'm drifting out. This is in the Thousand Islands, and you get a nice pan, but you try not to shake too much, and it gives you like a pleasing video aspect. Knowing your subject is very important, and hunting and wildlife photography are very similar. You really have to have respect for the environment and understand animal behavior. You have to understand diver behavior when you're trying to take pictures of divers, take video of divers. One of the hardest things to do if you haven't had a good conversation with your model ahead of time is getting them to do the right thing, to swim in the right place. It's counterintuitive, especially with a fisheye lens, that you really want them to be very close. We have 2 dive models in the audience here who know how hard that can be. And you really want to minimize your motion in bubbles. Larry really minimizes the bubbles using a rebreather. I will accept a few bubbles, but obviously the more bubbles, the less likely you are to be able to sneak up on something that's skittish. Chasing the subject never, ever works. If you see something cool going by, whether it's a manta ray or whatever, just forget it. Wait, you'll either come back or you miss the shot. You're just going to burn through your gas, and you're not going to get a shot. You're going to get a shot of a butt of something going away. Have patience. A lot of these, especially the small animals, are very territorial. You'll see interesting little creatures that really just stay around one area of the reef, and so when you show up, they're going to zoop and hide. But if you wait there long enough, especially if you don't make a lot of noise, and you just mount your camera firmly, put your elbows in the sand, or even use a tripod, eventually they'll come back. So it's really about setting up the shot and waiting for the peak of the action. That's what gives you good footage, and that's what makes really interesting videos. Here, it's like I knew what was going to happen to this guy. Boom. Those are lionfish. I mean, lionfish is something that divers hate. They're an invasive species from the South Pacific, and basically every diver in the Caribbean is now trying to eradicate them, fighting a losing battle against them. But no, I knew that guy was going to go for the lionfish. Be prepared for opportunities. I was hanging around just waiting my turn to get back into a boat in one of the local wrecks, and these guys sort of swam by. So I had my camera. I always have my camera set up in an automatic mode, so if anything shows up interesting, you can just grab it. And there was a little school of banded rudderfish that I never would have seen if I wasn't ready to grab it. Human faces, very important. People love looking at other people. So that's why putting divers in a shot makes a difference between just some blah shot of a coral reef and an interesting shot of a diver by a coral reef. So, And then this, I have to do is getting a nice head-on illumination so you can see the person's face and the expression. It just makes it a lot more interesting. There's Renata with a fish. There's Steve. Three-dimensional space is important. One of the things about diving is you really are adrift in this world, in the three-dimensional world, in ways that we aren't. We're just walking around. I think you want to emphasize that to non-divers and understand exactly what it is. People often say, I couldn't dive because I'm too claustrophobic. And it just seems to me this is the reverse. You're so free to move in any dimension. You really are not hemmed in, but I understand what they're saying. But that three-dimensional space, and that's done by sort of, again, a lot of these sort of trailing pans that'll really give people the idea that they're not just looking at a static tableau, but actually an interesting world of underwater wonder. That's the Thousand Islands again. You see if you have somebody going behind something, it emphasizes the three-dimensionality of it. And motion. I mean, I don't have to tell you the difference between my talk and Larry's talk is motion. But it's amazing how much footage you see of just some diver swimming slowly by. I mean, show people doing interesting things. It's not hard to catch. And 10, shoot some topside as well. Remember, when you're putting these your video together afterwards, you get into post-production, you want to be able to tell a story, and often that means setting the scene before you get underwater, show where people are, show what the day was like, and so always don't forget to shoot a little topside video, even if you're using your underwater camera. This was a club trip out to Dutch Springs where we were doing some introduction to Northeast diving for people who hadn't done it before. That's Emily. She's just won on Sweet Genius, Top Chef. And this gives you an idea what it might be like getting back into a local dive boat on a kind of a rough day. Macro. I don't do a lot of macro. I'll tell you a few things about it. Video lights are very helpful here because you're shooting just a few inches away from the end. So here's where you're really going to bring the color in and not worry about the fall off. The problem is because your angle of view is so narrow, the camera shake is really amplified. So if you can brace the camera, good. Focus problems, really turn off the autofocus because on macro, where the depth of field is very small, you're going to have a lot of video of the autofocus just hunting. So it's better if you use manual focus for that. Depth of field is more of an issue with macro than wide angle because if you're taking a video of something relatively small with a small depth of field, you'll see like the eyes in focus, the rest not in focus. Avoid trying to changing the subject distance. Basically just sort of lock yourself into one space. I'm going to show you some really bad I could hardly find any. See, there's a camera movement. Whoa. This is why I don't do much of it. I guess maybe I'll try to learn how to do it. depth of field problem. You see how like parts of the fish are in focus, parts aren't. Here's the autofocus going back and forth trying to get a lock on the thing. And here I actually managed to get in some nice macro video, but I didn't turn on the video lights, so everything looks, even though it's just a few feet away because it's fairly deep, everything is green. So I got some work to do. Next year I'll come back and tell you about macro. A few more video tips. Always shoot a little extra footage before and after there's the action, because it makes editing easier. A lot of people will shoot something and then move their camera away, and you can't really, it makes it very hard to edit later if you don't have bumpers on either side of your actual interesting footage. We don't really use zoom, we don't use telephoto underwater, so really try to avoid zooming even during a shot. It never looks good. Shoot a lot of different shots in the end, so when you're doing your post-production and editing, you can really establish a flow and tell a story. White balance, as I said, it's important to do that fairly frequently. If you notice the video I had of Pete, the videographer, he had one of his fins was white, and that's because he taped white duct tape onto the fin so he could do the white balance off a white instead of carrying a slate. And avoid shooting down. Common mistake of underwater photographers who are just starting out is to take a picture down to the fish. You don't really want to see the diver's perspective. You want to be shooting up, so you got some nice background blue there, and you've got some, sort of a fisheye view of the thing. And I'm going to finish up just showing you, this is the season I used the GoPro on the local shipwrecks, just to show you what you can get with it. Number one, to show you the kind of video you can get with a GoPro, and number two, to show you what local diving looks like. So this is the wide angle with ambient light. And you see it's kind of washed out. Again, wide angle thing.
The Hero 2, right?
The Hero 2, yeah.
What's the location?
And there it's a mix of things. So this one here, I got a little light here, bringing a little color into thing. You see, actually, the GoPro does, if you got ambient light, it's relatively shallow. This is on top of a shallow wreck. You get pretty good, you get pretty good color range. Here I added a video light, so we're a little deeper here, and it picks up a little more color and more detail in the divers' faces. This is when I was first starting out. I was a lot more shaky. And by putting that light on there, it emphasizes sort of the 3D nature of the scene, because you're going to light up somebody as they get closer, and there's a lot of fall off in the background. I mean, again, this is without a filter again. So here, by lighting up the foreground, it sort of makes it look three-dimensional. There's Britta again. And it's actually quite a bit of life around these shipwrecks. People are often surprised to see that. What lights do is they pick up the color in the foreground images, but again, as I was saying before, you see really about 2-3 feet is about as far as it'll go, and everything in the background is sort of green and washed out. But there's a lot of surprising amount of color, especially with the growth on older shipwrecks that have been down for a while. It's a lot of anemones covering them. Fish, little place there. This is in an overhead environment where it's sort of inside the wreck, and shooting up with the lights gives you detail there when it's in the shade. Again, shooting up towards the sky, we get a nice detail from having a light going up. Now these are hot spots. You see how the problem with the GoPro is the dynamic range isn't very good. So you see here we go from burnt out hot spot here to darkness in one frame, or if somebody's moving in towards you, a zoom shot, you're going to see she's going to move right into my light, and you can see the difference there. This is I'm shooting into a hole at this lobster here, so the whole periphery is all hot spotted out. Again, you get what you pay for. Here I cropped that same video, and you see that sort of gets rid of the hot spots. That's one trick you can do when you're shooting into a hole. This is a single light. You can sort of see the fall off. You see where the shadow is. That's dark, that's light, and you can see it when you're moving the light source. It's not as good. If you add dual lights, it makes a big difference. Lights up the whole scene. You don't see that disturbing sort of dark light juncture. This I did when I was doing bottle diving, and I put a GoPro on a stick, and I was digging around for bottles. This is last weekend in New Rochelle Harbor, and you can actually take video of myself here with I'm holding the GoPro like this, and finally, DSLRs are pretty big. That's a digital SLR. The GoPros are small, and you can put them just about anywhere. I have some endoscopy video I'll show you. And let's see. So that's about it for that part. I mean, this post-production, again, I don't really have time to talk about it, but I use iMovie. I find it's good for my purposes. I mean, obviously, professional videographers use Final Cut Pro or Avid or whatever, but I can answer questions about that if you have any. And this is my website that has some of my video and images, and feel free to take a look at that, and you can contact me through there. If you think of any questions later that you'd like to ask me, I'm happy to talk about diving. or photography or videography or anything else. That's it. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, I saw you had some audio, Michael.
Yeah.
Oh, really enjoyed it. You had some audio.
Uh-huh.
Is that right off the 7D? Do you ever bring any other audio?
Oh, well, that was a mistake. Normally when I do, see, I was focusing on the video aspects of it, so I blanked out generally the audio track is just breathing. And it's,
Right.
When I make videos, which again, I don't really have time to show you, but I spend a lot of time trying to get the audio track correct. And there's the soundtrack, because that makes a big difference in sort of driving the, driving the narrative. If you have some classical, some rock, some blues, there's a whole, if you'll go to that website, you can see them all there. And I spend a lot of time trying to line up cuts with changes in the music. It's sort of a whole separate thing. I really just made these things specifically for this lecture just to show filming techniques. But yes, normally there's. Yes.
Have you ever lost a camera? Leakage of a case?
Well, I did have one that my the Icolite, the old Icolite. And if you're here when I was taking it, but it's not a great design. It's a kind of a cheaper design, and the O-ring isn't really kind of tightly held in the housing. It just sits there, and it's held by the water pressure that holds the dome port on. So if you take it out, the O-ring is just sitting there, which is normally fine, but I'd taken it out to throw out some dust, didn't realize that the O-ring had dropped out, put it back together. It was early on, but I learned. That's because of that, now I got this nice new housing, see? If I hadn't trashed the old housing, I never would have got that. And I got a new camera too, so yeah. Okay, other than that, I haven't had any problems with leakage.
Also, in terms of how long do your gaskets normally last?
It depends on your depth and your, exertion. Dives usually are less than an hour or so.
Do cold water?
Yeah, well, that little GoPro thing was these were all local wrecks.
Cold water, up north, Nova Scotia.
Pretty cold water here.
Well, let me show some stuff
there's
down there.
Newfoundland. He's gonna have some pictures of Newfoundland, which is colder than here.
Yeah.
That's about the only place we've gone colder. I was at Dutch Springs on New Year's Eve, which is pretty cold. What? Thousand Islands is not cold water.
Well, not in the
72 degrees top to bottom.
Well, it's summertime, but
You're Russian and you're telling me the Thousand Islands is cold? It's like a bath. I'm surprised you wear a bathing suit. Right. Well, we don't go there in the winter. you go into Lake Ontario. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I like there in the summer where it's nice. Any other questions? All right. Thank you.
Okay.
For more information, please visit us online, give us a call, or stop by our New York City Superstore. You can also connect with us on the web.